5 a.m. The faint cry of Mikey pierced through Lily's sleep, dragging her from the fragile rest she'd found on the cold, hard floor of the abandoned warehouse. If you could even call it rest, the brief respite her exhausted body managed amidst the biting cold and the unforgiving concrete. Her 11 years carried the weight of a life most children couldn't fathom, a life where survival was a daily battle and love the only weapon. Beside her, Sammy slept soundly, wrapped in a threadbare blanket that barely shielded him from the cutting draft that snaked through the cracked walls. Lily felt every bone ache, every muscle beg for relief, but responsibility pulsed through her veins like an untamed river, reminding her that the fragility of those two babies rested solely on her strength. With slow, careful movements, Lily rose, trying not to disturb Sammy's sleep. She knew that every minute of rest was a precious gift for the little one, whose frail body constantly fought against weakness. She picked up Mikey, cradling him gently as her eyes scanned the meager space for some way to soothe his persistent crying. The almost empty can of formula sent a jolt of despair through her heart. There was only enough left for 2, maybe 3 bottles, if she dared to dilute the mixture, sacrificing nutrition for quantity. But then what? The question echoed in her mind like distant thunder, a premonition of an impending storm. The money she'd found in her mom's pants pocket, a fleeting reminder of better times, had slipped through her fingers like sand, leaving her adrift in a sea of uncertainty. The abandoned warehouse, once a symbol of broken dreams, now served as a fragile sanctuary for this makeshift family. Located in the heart of downtown Chicago, it was dwarfed by towering skyscrapers and sleek office buildings, where well-dressed people hurried by, glued to their phones, stepping in and out of luxurious cars. A distant, unattainable world that seemed to belong to another planet. Lily watched them with a mix of fascination and longing, imagining what it would be like to have the carefree look on their faces, the security pulsing in their chests, the certainty of a future stretching out before them. But reality snapped her back with Mikey's increasingly desperate cries, reminding her that her planet was made of hunger, cold, and fear. Survival had taught her to move in the shadows, to be invisible to the eyes of society. She'd learned that if anyone found her with the babies, they would be ripped from her arms, thrown into a cold, impersonal system. Her mother's words echoed in her mind like a haunting melody. "If anything happens to me, don't let them take them. Promise me, Lily. Promise." And she had promised, with the innocence and fierce loyalty only a child possesses, sealing a pact with her mother's memory. A pact she now carried as both a burden and a blessing. At 7 a.m., as the city began to stir, Lily prepared for another desperate quest for sustenance. She left Sammy sleeping, hidden behind stacks of discarded crates, and ventured out with Mikey in her arms, her heart heavy with worry. Lily walked 3 blocks to the bakery, a small family-run establishment where the owner sometimes gave her day-old bread. Mr. Peterson was a kind man, his face etched with the lines of hard work and compassion, but his wife, a stern woman with suspicious eyes, watched Lily with distrust, her lips often pursed in a disapproving frown. Lily ignored the glares, focusing on the hope that Mr. Peterson would offer a small reprieve from their gnawing hunger. She clutched Mikey closer, his small body radiating a fragile warmth against the morning chill, a warmth that was quickly fading as his cries weakened. "Please, Mr. Peterson," Lily pleaded softly when the old man came out to unlock the door, his hands gnarled and dusted with flour. "Do you have anything for my little brother?" Mr. Peterson's gaze softened as he looked at Mikey, who was sucking on his tiny fingers, his eyes wide with hunger. "Where's your mama, child?" he asked, his voice gentle. "Working," Lily lied, the words sliding off her tongue like a well-worn coin. "She'll be back tonight." The man hesitated for a moment, then disappeared into the back, returning with 2 slightly stale loaves of bread and a small carton of milk. "Can't give you more than this." Mrs. Peterson gets angry. "Thank you, Mr. Peterson. God bless you," Lily whispered, her heart filled with a flicker of gratitude amidst the ever-present despair. Meanwhile, 15 miles away, in the affluent suburb of Oak Brook, Richard Maxwell woke up in his king-size bed with silk sheets. His sprawling mansion overlooked the Chicago skyline, a glittering tapestry of ambition and success. From his window he could see the distant, less fortunate neighborhoods, a stark contrast to his manicured lawns and the quiet elegance of his surroundings. He rarely thought about those parts of the city. They were simply a backdrop to his own achievements. Richard showered in his marble bathroom, the hot water a soothing balm to his skin. He put on a $3,000 Italian suit and descended to breakfast. His housekeeper, Mrs. Jenkins, had everything ready: eggs Benedict, freshly squeezed orange juice, and gourmet coffee. "Good morning, Mr. Maxwell." Mrs. Jenkins greeted him with a warm smile. "Your driver is waiting outside." Richard barely acknowledged her, his attention already consumed by his phone, scrolling through reports from his real estate development company. At 38, he had built an empire from the ground up, and there was no time for pleasantries. "Cancel the 10 a.m. meeting," he barked into his phone to his assistant. "The downtown project is stalled, and I want to personally oversee it." He strode out to his armored Mercedes-Benz, the epitome of his wealth and power. As the driver navigated the bustling streets of Chicago, Richard reviewed contracts and signed documents, his mind a whirlwind of deals and deadlines. To him, the city was a grid of numbers: square footage, construction costs, projected profits. He saw opportunities where others saw chaos, and his ambition knew no bounds. He was a force of nature, reshaping the urban landscape with his relentless drive. He didn't notice the barefoot girl walking along the sidewalk, cradling what appeared to be 2 babies. Lily, her face etched with worry beyond her years, was invisible in his world of power and influence. Her ragged clothes and desperate stride were simply part of the city's background noise, a problem for someone else to solve. Richard was a master of his own universe, and that universe rarely intersected with the harsh realities faced by those on the fringes of society. Lily returned to the abandoned warehouse and found Sammy crying. He had a fever and his diaper was soiled. Only one clean diaper remained. "Oh, my love," she whispered, changing him with gentle hands. "You need medicine." She knew. She had to take him to a clinic, but she also knew the questions they would ask, the authorities they might involve. Where are your parents? Where do you live? Who takes care of you? The fear of losing her brothers was a constant shadow, a weight that threatened to crush her. She prepared a bottle with the milk from the bakery. Sammy drank a little but then refused it, his forehead burning with fever. Despair tightened its grip on Lily's heart. She felt so alone, so utterly powerless, against the forces that threatened to tear her little family apart. The city, with its towering buildings and bustling crowds, seemed indifferent to their plight, a cold and uncaring giant. At 11 a.m., Richard arrived at the downtown construction site. It was a 20-story office building, a testament to his ambition, scheduled to be completed in 6 months. It represented a $50 million investment, a figure that both thrilled and consumed him. He thrived on the pressure, the high stakes, the constant push to achieve more. Success was his addiction, and he chased it relentlessly. "Mr. Maxwell," the project manager greeted him, a hint of worry in his voice. "We have a problem with the environmental permits." Richard's brow furrowed. Bureaucratic hurdles were his nemesis, obstacles that cost him money, and money was time. "What kind of problem?" he demanded, his voice sharp. "They found families living in the abandoned buildings in the area. The city says we have to wait for them to relocate." Richard scanned the surroundings. 2 blocks away, he could see the dilapidated structures where people supposedly lived. To him, they were nothing more than roadblocks to progress, eyesores that marred the cityscape. "How long?" he demanded, his impatience barely contained. "Maybe a month." A month meant fines, extra pay for the workers, interest on loans. Richard mentally calculated $500,000 lost. The thought was like a physical blow, fueling his anger. He was a man of action, a man who bent the world to his will, and this delay was unacceptable. "Speed up the process," he ordered, his voice sharp and decisive. "Talk to whoever you need to talk to. This can't wait." He had no idea that just a few blocks away, a young girl of 11 was silently weeping as her baby brother grew sicker, wondering if she should risk everything and beg for help. The 2 worlds, Richard's and Lily's, existed in the same city, breathed the same air, but were separated by an invisible chasm of privilege and desperation. Then destiny, in its unpredictable way, decided to intervene. Sammy's cries intensified, becoming a desperate rattling sound that tore at Lily's heart. She had held him in her arms all night, feeling his small body grow hotter and hotter. Mikey was also restless, sensing the danger that threatened his twin brother. The warehouse, their supposed refuge, felt more like a trap, its walls closing in on her. "Please, God," Lily whispered, rocking Sammy gently. "Don't take him too." The memory of her mother, coughing blood in this very same abandoned building, haunted her like a relentless ghost. Her mother, Sarah, had dismissed her illness as just a bad cold, but then she couldn't get out of the makeshift bed they had built from cardboard boxes. In the end, she had become very still, very cold, and never spoke again. Lily was terrified of reliving that loss. At 6 a.m., Lily made a decision. Sammy needed a doctor, and she needed help. She couldn't do it alone anymore. The fear of what might happen warred with the desperate need to save her brother's life. It was a gamble, a desperate throw of the dice, but she had no other choice. She wrapped the babies in the only clean blankets she had and stepped out of the warehouse into the awakening city. The streets were beginning to fill with people heading to work, their faces set with purpose. Lily walked towards the wealthier part of town, the area where she'd seen the biggest cars and the best-dressed people. "Someone with money will help me," she told herself, trying to ignite a spark of hope in her weary soul. There has to be someone good. She clutched her brothers tighter, her small frame a fragile beacon of desperation against the backdrop of the uncaring city. Richard had a terrible night. The numbers for the downtown project weren't adding up. He had 3 crucial meetings that day, and his Brazilian partner was threatening to pull out of the investment if they didn't resolve the permit issue. The pressure was immense, a crushing weight on his shoulders. He was a man driven by success, and failure was not an option. "Mr. Maxwell," Mrs. Jenkins said as she poured him coffee, her brow furrowed with concern. "You look exhausted. Why don't you cancel today's meetings?" "Can't," Richard grunted, his voice rough with fatigue. "If I don't fix this today, I lose the whole deal." He grabbed his briefcase and headed for the door, the weight of the day pressing down on him. He was a man on a mission, and nothing would deter him. He got into his Mercedes and told the driver to go slowly. He needed to think, make calls, and salvage the deal before it was too late. The traffic was heavy on Michigan Avenue, a river of steel and glass reflecting the city's relentless energy. Richard used the time to review emails, his mind racing with solutions and strategies. He was a master strategist, a chess player of the business world, always several moves ahead. Suddenly, through the window, he saw something that made him frown. A very young girl was walking along the sidewalk carrying what looked like 2 babies. She was wearing dirty clothes and broken shoes, a stark contrast to the polished world he inhabited. "What's that girl doing alone with those babies?" he muttered, more to himself than to the driver. "Sir?" the driver asked. "Nothing. Keep driving." But Richard couldn't shake the image. The girl looked lost, desperate, a fragile figure against the harsh backdrop of the city. "Stop the car," he said suddenly, his voice firm. "Sir?" the driver asked, startled. "I said stop the car, turn around." The driver obeyed, confusion etched on his face. Richard stepped out of the Mercedes and strode back to where he had seen the girl. He felt an unusual pull, a nagging curiosity that disrupted his carefully ordered world. He was a man who followed his instincts, and something about this situation demanded his attention. He found her sitting on the steps of a bank, gently rocking one of the babies who was crying relentlessly. The girl looked up at him, her eyes wide and wary. She saw a tall, elegant man in an expensive suit and shiny shoes. He looked like one of those important people she saw rushing by every day, oblivious to her existence. But this one had stopped, and for a reason she couldn't yet fathom. "Hey," Richard said, his voice surprisingly gentle, a stark contrast to the sharp commands he usually barked in the boardroom. "Are you all right?" Lily Bow looked up at him, her gaze guarded and suspicious. She had learned to be wary of strangers, to anticipate the judgment or indifference in their eyes. But this man's expression was different. a flicker of genuine concern that confused her. She saw the expensive suit, the polished shoes, the aura of power, and yet there was something else, something that made her hesitate before retreating into her shell. "My little brother is sick," she said directly, her voice small but firm. "He needs a doctor?" There was no room for polite conversation, no energy for pretense. The urgency of Sammy's condition eclipsed any fear or uncertainty she felt in the presence of this imposing figure. Richard stepped closer, his attention drawn to the baby in Lily's arms. Sammy's face was flushed, and his breathing was rapid and shallow. Even Richard, who knew nothing about children, could see that something was seriously wrong. The child's frailty was a stark contrast to the opulence that surrounded them, a jarring reminder of the inequalities that existed within the city. He felt a strange unease, a prickling sensation that disrupted his usual detachment. "Where are your parents?" he asked, the question hanging in the air with a weight he hadn't intended. He expected a simple answer, a quick explanation, but he was about to be drawn into a world he had actively avoided acknowledging for most of his life. "Okay, I understand. I'll continue the story, ensuring each paragraph has at least 600 characters. Contador, paragrafo 29 30, 80. Paragrafos restantes 50. "I don't have any," Lily replied, her voice flat, devoid of the emotional inflections of a child. "It's just us." Richard's gaze swept over the scene. People hurried past, their eyes averted, their footsteps quickening as if afraid of catching something from this ragged tableau. Some glanced with fleeting curiosity, a mixture of pity and discomfort, but no one stopped. No one offered help. The indifference of the city, its cold efficiency, struck Richard with a force he couldn't explain. He was a man who prided himself on solving problems, on taking charge, but this situation defied his usual methods. There was no deal to be made, no contract to be signed, just the raw, undeniable need of a child and her ailing brother. He felt a flicker of something unfamiliar, a stirring of empathy that challenged his carefully constructed detachment from the human cost of his ambition. "How long has he been like this?" Richard asked, his voice softer now, the edge of impatience replaced by a hesitant concern. "Since last night. He's really hot." Richard remained silent for a moment, his mind a battleground of conflicting priorities. He had 3 crucial meetings, a $50 million deal hanging in the balance, his Brazilian partner waiting for his decision. His world, his carefully orchestrated life, demanded his immediate attention. Yet, the image of the feverish baby, the girl's desperate eyes, held him captive. He was a man of action, but for the first time he felt paralyzed by indecision. The weight of his responsibilities clashed with a growing sense of obligation, a feeling that defied his usual self-interest. "Come on," he said finally, the words surprising even himself. "I'll take you to the hospital." Lily didn't move, her wariness battling with a fragile thread of hope. "Really?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Yeah, let's go. What's going to happen to us after?" Richard had no answer for that. He didn't even know why he was doing this, stepping outside the carefully defined boundaries of his life. "Let's get your brother some help first. We'll figure out the rest later." The "we" hung in the air, a word that hinted at a connection he wasn't yet ready to acknowledge. In the Mercedes, Lily sat in the back seat, cradling both babies in her arms. She held them with a quiet strength, her movements practiced and sure, a testament to the years she'd spent as their sole caregiver. Richard sat in the front, his phone pressed to his ear, canceling his meetings one by one. Each call was a sacrifice, a tearing away from the life he knew. But the image of Sammy's flushed face and labored breathing haunted him, silencing the voice of his ambition. The city blurred past the windows, the skyscrapers and bustling crowds fading into a meaningless backdrop. All that mattered was the fragile life in the back seat, and the girl who guarded it with such fierce devotion. He glanced at her in the rearview mirror, observing her composure, her quiet intensity. She didn't seem scared, just incredibly serious for her age, as if she carried the weight of the world on her small shoulders. "What's your name?" Richard asked, breaking the silence that hung heavy in the car. Lily hesitated for a moment, her eyes searching his for any sign of deceit. She was used to being invisible, to being ignored. and this sudden attention from a powerful stranger was both unsettling and strangely comforting. "Lily," she replied softly, her voice barely a whisper above the hum of the engine. "And these are Mikey and Sammy. Are they your brothers?" Richard inquired, his gaze shifting to the sleeping infants. "Yeah, they're twins, 8 months old," Lily answered, a flicker of pride softening her hardened features. Richard did some quick mental calculations. An 11, maybe 12-year-old girl, taking care of 2 babies alone. The thought was staggering, a condemnation of a system that had failed these children so spectacularly. Where were the social services? How had they slipped through the cracks? The questions swirled in his mind, a storm of anger and confusion directed at a world he had always taken for granted. At the hospital, everything moved quickly. Doctors and nurses rushed Sammy away, their faces serious and focused. Mikey also needed to be checked over, his cries echoing through the sterile halls. Lily watched, her heart pounding in her chest. The fear she had been holding at bay, threatening to overwhelm her. The hospital, with its bright lights and bustling activity, was a stark contrast to the shadows she was used to, a place of healing and hope, but also of terrifying uncertainty. She clung to the hope that these professionals could save Sammy, that they possessed the knowledge and resources she lacked. But the possibility of losing him, of being separated from her brothers, was a knife twisting in her gut. She felt Richard's presence beside her, a solid if unexpected anchor in the storm of her emotions. A nurse approached Richard, her expression questioning. "Are you the father?" she asked, her gaze lingering on the contrast between his expensive suit and Lily's ragged appearance. Richard glanced at Lily, who was watching him intently, her eyes searching his for an answer. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, a battle raging within him. To deny the connection would be to abandon these children to an uncertain fate. To admit it would be to step into a responsibility he wasn't prepared for. Yet the memory of Sammy's labored breathing, the image of Lily's unwavering devotion, compelled him to make a choice. Yes, he lied, the word a commitment he hadn't intended to make. "I'm their father." In that moment, Richard Maxwell, the ruthless businessman, the master of his own destiny, made a decision that would irrevocably alter the course of his life. A decision driven by an impulse he couldn't quite comprehend. In the waiting room of the hospital, Richard began to grasp the magnitude of his lie. He was Richard Maxwell, a man who built empires, not families. He was accustomed to control, to dictating outcomes, not to the messy, unpredictable realities of human relationships. Yet here he was, sitting in a sterile room, surrounded by the beeping of machines and the hushed whispers of medical personnel, all because of a decision he had made on impulse. He felt a strange mix of fear and exhilaration, a sense of being adrift in unfamiliar territory. The carefully constructed walls he had built around his emotions were crumbling, exposing a vulnerability he had long suppressed. He glanced at Lily, who sat beside him, her gaze fixed on the door through which Sammy had disappeared. Her stoicism was both admirable and heartbreaking, a mask that barely concealed the anxiety churning beneath the surface. A social worker approached him, clipboard in hand, her smile professional and practiced. "Mr. Maxwell, I need some information for the children's medical records," she said, her voice smooth and efficient. "I'm Marcella Evans." Richard nodded, trying to project an air of confidence he didn't feel. He was accustomed to negotiating deals, not providing personal details about a family that didn't exist. He felt like an imposter, a fraud, and the fear of being exposed gnawed at him. Lily remained silent, her eyes darting between Richard and the social worker, her expression unreadable. "Of course," Richard replied, striving for a tone of assurance. "Father's full name, Richard Maxwell." The social worker scribbled on her form. "And the mother's name?" Richard felt the ground shift beneath his feet. He had no idea of Lily's last name, much less the name of the supposed mother. He was a man of meticulous planning, but this situation had thrown him into a chaotic whirlwind of improvisation. "Sarah," Lily said suddenly, her voice clear and firm, cutting through Richard's internal panic. "Sarah Miller." Marcella wrote it down on the form, her pen scratching against the paper. Richard shot Lily a grateful look, a silent acknowledgement of her quick thinking. He was beginning to see that this girl, despite her age and circumstances, possessed a remarkable resilience and intelligence. She was a survivor, a strategist in her own right, and he felt a growing respect for her. "Current address?" Marcella continued, her focus unwavering. Richard hesitated again. He couldn't give his real address. His opulent mansion in Oakbrook. It was too far removed from Lily's reality, too incongruent with the image he was trying to project. He needed a plausible location, a place that wouldn't raise suspicion. He glanced around the sterile waiting room, his eyes landing on a discarded magazine with an advertisement for a downtown apartment complex. 123 Main Street, Apartment 4B, Richard stated, the address a fabricated construct built on the fly. Lily looked at him, her expression a mixture of surprise and curiosity, but she remained silent. She was learning to trust this stranger, to rely on his unexpected intervention, but a part of her remained wary, a protective instinct honed by years of hardship. "The children will need booster shots," Marcella continued, her voice businesslike. "Do you have their vaccination records?" Richard's mind raced. He had no records, no history to provide. He was building a narrative from scraps of truth and lies, a fragile structure that could crumble at any moment. "We lost them in the move," he blurted out, the excuse sounding weak even to his own ears. Marcella's brow furrowed slightly, but she continued writing, her professionalism unwavering. "Health insurance?" she inquired. "Private. The best you have." The questions kept coming, each one a tightrope walk for Richard, a test of his ability to maintain the facade he had created. After what felt like an eternity filling out forms, a young doctor in a white coat appeared. "Mr. Maxwell," he said, his voice tired but kind. "I'm Dr. Ramirez. Sammy has a pretty severe respiratory infection. He needs to be hospitalized for at least 3 days." Lily's face paled, her eyes widening with a terror that mirrored Richard's own growing anxiety. "Is he going to be okay?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The doctor offered a reassuring smile. "With the right treatment, he'll make a full recovery," he said gently. "But you brought him in just in time. 1 more day, and it would have been much more complicated." Richard felt a wave of relief wash over him, a strange and unexpected emotion. He didn't understand why he cared so much about a baby he had met only hours ago, a child who was, technically, a stranger. Yet the thought of Sammy's suffering, of Lily's anguish, had pierced through his usual indifference, revealing a capacity for compassion he had long buried beneath layers of ambition and self-interest. "And the other baby, Mikey, is he all right?" Richard asked, his concern genuine. "Mikey is fine, just a little dehydrated. You can take him home, but he needs to come back tomorrow for a checkup," Dr. Ramirez replied. Marcella approached again, her expression serious. "Mr. Maxwell, I need to speak with you in private." Richard followed the social worker to a small office, his mind racing with apprehension. He knew that his carefully constructed story was fragile, that the truth could unravel at any moment. The weight of his impulsive decision pressed down on him, and he wondered if he had bitten off more than he could chew. Through the glass window of the office, he could see Lily hugging Mikey tightly, her small frame a protective shield against the uncertainty of their situation. He felt a surge of protectiveness towards her, a desire to shield her from the harsh realities of the world, even though he had no right to do so. "Mr. Maxwell, forgive my directness, but there are some inconsistencies in the information," Marcella began, her voice calm but firm as she closed the office door, shutting out the sounds of the bustling hospital. Richard braced himself. The moment of reckoning had arrived. He knew that his carefully constructed facade was about to crumble under the weight of scrutiny. He was a man who valued truth and precision in his business dealings, but here he was, entangled in a web of deception, all for the sake of 2 children he had met just that morning. The irony of his situation was not lost on him. The successful, businessman brought to his knees by an act of impulsive compassion. "The girl says her mother died 3 months ago, but you listed Sarah Miller as the mother and indicated that she is alive," Marcella stated, her eyes sharp and perceptive. Richard felt his mouth go dry, his carefully rehearsed explanations deserting him. He was a master of words, a skilled negotiator, but now he was tongue-tied, caught in the crosshairs of his own good intentions. Richard glanced back at the waiting room, his gaze drawn to Lily, who had her face pressed against the glass of the door, trying to see where Sammy had been taken. Her vulnerability was palpable, a stark contrast to the strength she had displayed earlier. In that moment, Richard knew he couldn't continue the charade. He couldn't betray the trust that this young girl had placed in him, however reluctantly. He couldn't allow his fear of exposure to overshadow the genuine concern he felt for these children. "No," he admitted finally, his voice low and resigned. "I'm not their father. I met them this morning. The girl asked me for help." Marcella sighed, her expression softening slightly, a hint of understanding replacing the professional detachment. "Mr. Maxwell, this is a very serious matter. We're talking about 3 minors in a state of abandonment. What's going to happen to them? I have to report this case." Her words were a stark reminder of the consequences of his actions, the potential for these children to be lost in the system, separated and forgotten. "They'll probably go into foster care while we investigate if they have any family," Marcella explained, her tone neutral but tinged with a hint of sadness. "The babies could go to a group home, and the girl to a shelter for minors her age. It's standard procedure." Richard felt a coldness spread through him, a chilling realization of the consequences of his inaction. He had stumbled into this situation with a vague notion of helping, of doing the right thing, but he hadn't fully considered the system he was up against, the impersonal machinery of bureaucracy that could easily crush these fragile lives. He thought of Lily's fierce protectiveness, the way she cradled her brothers as if they were the most precious things in the world, and the thought of them being separated, lost in the system, filled him with a visceral sense of dread. He was a man who moved mountains, who commanded respect, but in this moment, he felt utterly powerless against the forces that threatened to tear this makeshift family apart. Richard fell silent, his mind racing, searching for a solution, a way to circumvent the system, to protect these children from its cold embrace. He remembered the look in Lily's eyes when she had pleaded for his help, the unwavering devotion she displayed towards her brothers, the quiet strength that belied her young age. He thought of his own life, his meticulously ordered existence, his spacious mansion where the laughter of children had never echoed. He had always prioritized success, achievement, the accumulation of wealth, but now he was confronted with a different kind of wealth, the intangible value of human connection, the profound responsibility of caring for vulnerable lives. A crazy idea began to form in his mind, a long shot, a deviation from his usual pragmatic approach, but it was the only option that offered a glimmer of hope. "Is there any way to avoid that?" he asked, his voice low and intense. "Would it be possible for me to become their temporary guardian?" Marcella's eyebrows rose in surprise, her professional composure momentarily faltering. "You don't know anything about children, Mr. Maxwell," she pointed out, her voice laced with skepticism. "But you brought them to the hospital. You're paying for their medical expenses. The judge might consider that you have a connection with them." Her words offered a sliver of possibility, a fragile hope that Richard could somehow navigate this uncharted territory. He thought of his life, his predictable routine, his meticulously planned days, and a strange yearning stirred within him, a desire for something more than the relentless pursuit of success. The idea of bringing these children into his world was daunting, a complete upheaval of everything he knew, but it also held a strange allure, a promise of a different kind of fulfillment. "What would I have to do?" Richard asked, his voice hesitant, as if afraid to voice the unspoken desire that had taken root in his heart. "Sign as their temporary guardian while we complete the investigation," Marcella explained, her tone becoming more businesslike again. "It would be for a maximum of 6 months." She paused, her gaze direct and unwavering. "And if you don't agree this afternoon, I will have to place them in the appropriate institutions." Her words were a stark ultimatum, a clear delineation of the stakes involved. Richard closed his eyes, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He could visualize Lily's face, the tears that would surely fall when her brothers were taken away, the image of the babies alone in cold, impersonal cribs, surrounded by strangers. The thought was unbearable, a violation of the unspoken bond that had formed between them in the space of a few hours. "Can I have some time to think about it?" Richard asked, his voice barely audible, his usual confidence replaced by a vulnerability he rarely allowed himself to express. He needed to weigh the implications of this decision, the potential consequences for his carefully constructed life, but the image of Lily's hopeful gaze, the fragile trust she had placed in him, tugged at his conscience. He was a man who prided himself on his logic and rationality, but in this moment, his heart overruled his head. The thought of walking away, of leaving these children to the cold indifference of the system, was unbearable. He felt an unexpected surge of protectiveness, a desire to shield them from the harsh realities of the world, even though he had no right to do so. The clock was ticking and the weight of his decision pressed down on him, a stark reminder that the lives of these children hung in the balance. "You have 1 hour," Marcella replied, her voice firm but not unkind. "After that, I have to make the official report." Her words were a stark reminder of the urgency of the situation, the limited window of opportunity that Richard had to change the course of these children's lives. He nodded slowly, his mind racing, trying to reconcile the life he knew with the unexpected path that had opened before him. He was a man of action, a man who made decisions with swift certainty, but this was different. This was not a business deal, not a negotiation, but a choice that would define him in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. He turned and walked back to the waiting room, his steps heavy with the weight of his impending decision, the future of 3 young lives resting on his shoulders. Richard returned to the waiting room, his steps slow and deliberate, his mind still wrestling with the enormity of the decision before him. He saw Lily's eyes, wide with a mixture of hope and apprehension, as she watched him approach. He saw the way she instinctively pulled Mikey closer, a protective gesture that spoke volumes about her fierce love for her brothers. He felt a pang of guilt, a recognition of the privilege he had always taken for granted, the security and stability that had been denied to this young girl and her vulnerable siblings. He was a man who valued control, who thrived on certainty, but in this moment, he felt utterly adrift, guided only by an unfamiliar impulse of compassion. He knew that his life would never be the same if he chose to take on this responsibility, that it would demand sacrifices and compromises he had never considered, but the thought of turning his back on these children was now unthinkable. "What did she say?" Lily asked, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes searching his for any indication of his decision. Richard hesitated, his gaze lingering on her face, trying to gauge her readiness for the truth. He knew that his words would shape her future, that they held the power to either offer her a lifeline or plunge her back into the darkness she had been struggling to escape. "Nothing important," Richard lied, the words a temporary shield against the weight of the moment. He wasn't ready to reveal the full extent of his decision, not until he had fully processed it himself. He needed to buy himself some time to gather his thoughts, to prepare himself for the upheaval that was about to unfold. "Are you hungry?" he asked, changing the subject, offering a small gesture of normalcy in the midst of the chaos. For the first time since he had met her, Lily's lips curved into a faint smile, a fragile bloom of gratitude that touched him in a way he couldn't explain. Richard went to the hospital cafeteria and bought sandwiches and juice boxes, the mundane task a welcome distraction from the emotional turmoil he was experiencing. He watched Lily as she ate, her movements economical, her focus intense. She consumed the food slowly, deliberately, as if savoring every bite, as if unsure when her next meal would come. It was a stark reminder of the deprivation she and her brothers had endured, a glimpse into a world of scarcity and hardship that Richard had only encountered in fleeting news reports or charitable appeals. The reality of their situation, the fragility of their existence, struck him with a force that shook his carefully constructed worldview. He was a man who measured success in dollars and cents, in square footage and profit margins, but now he was confronted with a different kind of poverty, a poverty of opportunity, of security, of basic human dignity. As they ate in silence, Richard observed Lily, trying to decipher the emotions that flickered beneath her stoic exterior. She glanced towards the door every few minutes, her anxiety for Sammy palpable. The weight of responsibility she carried, the burden of caring for two infants in a world that offered them no safety net, was etched on her young face. He wondered about her dreams, her aspirations, the childhood she had been denied. He saw a strength and resilience that defied her age, but also a vulnerability that tugged at his heart. He was beginning to see that these children were not just a problem to be solved, a situation to be managed, but individuals with their own stories, their own hopes and fears. "Lily," Richard said finally, his voice low and hesitant, "what do you want to happen to you and your brothers?" The question hung in the air, a pivotal moment that would determine the course of their lives. Lily stopped chewing, her small hand clutching the juice box tightly. She looked at Richard, her expression a mixture of confusion and suspicion. She was accustomed to people making decisions for her, to having her life dictated by circumstances beyond her control. This question, this genuine inquiry about her own desires, was unfamiliar and unsettling. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice cautious. Richard leaned forward, his gaze intent. "The social worker, Marcella, she says that you have to go to a special place for kids without parents, like a foster home or something." He watched her carefully, gauging her reaction, prepared for the tears or the outburst he expected from a child facing such upheaval. He was a man who anticipated outcomes, who planned for every contingency, but he was utterly unprepared for the quiet devastation that washed over Lily's face. Lily's eyes widened, filling with tears that threatened to spill over at any moment. The stoicism she had maintained for so long began to crumble, revealing the vulnerability of a child facing the loss of her only family. "Are they going to separate us?" she whispered, the question laced with a raw terror that pierced Richard's heart. He had seen grown men break under pressure, but the strength of this young girl, the unwavering love she displayed for her brothers, had touched him in a way he couldn't explain. He was a man who valued logic and reason, but in this moment his emotions threatened to overwhelm him. He wanted to shield her from the pain, to offer her a lifeline, but he knew that the truth, however harsh, was the only thing he could offer. "Maybe not," Richard said, his voice low and hesitant. "Maybe there's another option." He paused, taking a deep breath, steeling himself for the decision that would irrevocably alter the course of his life. "Maybe you can stay with me." Richard watched Lily's reaction, her face a complex tapestry of emotions. Disbelief, hope, and a fragile flicker of something akin to joy warred within her. She had lived in a world of constant uncertainty, where kindness was rare and security a distant dream. The idea that this wealthy stranger, this man, from a different world, was offering her a chance at stability, at a family, was almost too much to comprehend. She had learned to guard her heart, to expect disappointment, but something in Richard's eyes, a genuine sincerity she couldn't quite explain, gave her pause. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken questions and tentative possibilities. The weight of his offer hung heavy in the air, a pivotal moment that would determine the trajectory of their lives. "You mean it?" Lily whispered, her voice barely audible, her eyes searching Richard's for any hint of deception. She had been betrayed before, abandoned by a world that had turned a blind eye to her suffering. Trust was a luxury she could rarely afford, but in this moment, she desperately wanted to believe in the possibility of a better future. Richard met her gaze, his own expression earnest and unwavering. He was a man of his word, a man who valued integrity in his business dealings, and he realized that this commitment, this promise to a young girl, was more important than any contract or negotiation he had ever undertaken. "Yes, Lily, I mean it," he replied, his voice firm and resolute. "You and Mikey and Sammy, you can come home with me." The words were simple, yet they carried the weight of a life-altering decision, a commitment to a path he could not yet fully foresee. Richard signed the papers without reading all the fine print. His head was spinning, trying to process the magnitude of what he had just done. In a single morning, he had gone from being a single, driven businessman, free from any familial responsibilities, to becoming the temporary guardian of 3 minors. The transition was abrupt, jarring, a complete departure from the carefully orchestrated life he had always known. He felt a surge of adrenaline, a mix of trepidation and exhilaration, as if he had stepped off a cliff into the unknown. The familiar landmarks of his life, his career, his routines, his carefully constructed identity were receding into the distance, replaced by the uncharted territory of parenthood. He was a man who thrived on control, but he knew that this new path would demand a surrender of that control, a willingness to embrace the chaos and unpredictability of family life. "Mr. Maxwell," Marcella said, her voice gentle but firm as she gathered the documents, "I'll need to schedule a home visit for next week. It's part of the protocol." Richard nodded, his mind already racing with the logistical challenges that lay ahead. His mansion, a testament to his wealth and success, was designed for a single man who worked 12 hours a day, not for a young girl and 2 babies. He needed to create a safe and nurturing environment, a place where these children could heal and thrive, a task that felt both daunting and strangely compelling. "What kind of visit?" he asked, his voice hesitant. "To verify that the living arrangements are suitable for the children," Marcella explained. "I'll also want to speak with each of them separately to make sure they're adjusting well." Her words were a sobering reminder of the scrutiny he would be under, the responsibility he had undertaken. "I need to buy some things," Richard said, his mind already formulating a mental shopping list. Cribs, clothes, diapers, baby formula, and toys, appropriate for their age. He paused, realizing the inadequacy of his bachelor pad, the lack of anything that would make it feel like a home. For children. He was accustomed to acquiring assets, to building his fortune, but now he was faced with the challenge of creating a nurturing environment, of providing the basic necessities of life for 3 vulnerable individuals. The task felt both overwhelming and strangely exhilarating, a departure from the sterile world of business into the messy, unpredictable reality of human connection. He was a man who valued efficiency and order, but he knew that his life was about to become infinitely more complicated, and yet for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of purpose beyond the pursuit of wealth and success. Marcella handed him a list, her expression softening slightly. "Here's a list of the basics," she offered. Richard glanced at the list. It looked like an inventory for opening a daycare. The sheer volume of items, the sheer responsibility he had undertaken, hit him with full force. He was a man who delegated tasks, who relied on his staff to handle the details, but now he was facing the daunting prospect of becoming a caregiver, a provider, a father figure. He felt a surge of panic, quickly followed by a resolute determination. He had never backed down from a challenge, and he wasn't about to start now. He looked at Lily, who was standing quietly beside him, her gaze fixed on Mikey, her small hand stroking his hair with a gentle tenderness that belied her age. "Lily," he said, his voice surprisingly steady, "can you help me pick out the stuff?" "Of course," Lily replied, her voice soft but firm. She knew better than anyone the needs of her brothers. She had been their mother, their protector, their provider, for far too long. The idea that this wealthy stranger was willing to include her in the process, to value her knowledge and experience, was a novel and strangely empowering concept. She felt a flicker of hope, a fragile belief that maybe, just maybe, this unexpected turn of events could lead to a better future. As they walked back to the waiting room, Lily was no longer the wary, guarded child who had met Richard on the steps of the bank. A tentative trust had begun to blossom between them, a fragile connection forged in the crucible of desperation and compassion. Richard, in turn, felt a growing sense of responsibility, a recognition that he was no longer just a businessman, but a lifeline for these 3 vulnerable lives. When they returned to the waiting room, Lily was asleep in the chair, Mikey cradled in her arms. She looked so small, so exhausted, that Richard felt a pang of guilt. He realized that she probably hadn't slept well in months, her nights filled with the constant demands of caring for 2 infants, her days spent in a desperate struggle for survival. The weight of her responsibility, the burden she had carried alone for so long, was almost unbearable to contemplate. He was a man who valued efficiency and productivity, but now he was confronted with the profound reality of human endurance, the unwavering love and sacrifice of a young girl who had given up her childhood to protect her brothers. He was beginning to see that true wealth was not measured in dollars and cents, but in the strength of the human spirit, in the capacity for compassion and selflessness. "Hey," Richard said softly, touching Lily's shoulder gently. Lily startled awake, her eyes wide with alarm. The unfamiliar surroundings, the sterile smell of the hospital, the lingering fear for Sammy's well-being, all contributed to her disorientation. "What happened? Is Sammy okay?" she asked, her voice filled with panic. Richard reassured her, his tone calm and soothing. "Sammy's fine. The doctor will be here in a moment to tell us when we can visit him." Lily relaxed slightly, the tension easing from her small frame. The fear in her eyes, the vulnerability she had tried so hard to conceal, touched Richard deeply. He was beginning to see the immense responsibility she had shouldered, the extraordinary burden she had carried alone for so long. He was a man who valued strength and independence, but he was also learning to appreciate the resilience of the human spirit, the power of love and sacrifice in the face of overwhelming adversity. "The social worker, she's going to let us stay with you?" Lily asked, her voice still laced with a hint of disbelief. Richard sat down beside her, his gaze steady. "Yes, you're going to stay with me while we figure out the best solution for you." He hesitated, unsure how to explain the temporary nature of his guardianship, the uncertainty that still loomed over their future. He was a man who preferred definitive answers, clear outcomes, but he was learning to navigate the ambiguity of human relationships, the complexities of a situation that defied easy solutions. "At my house," Lily clarified, her eyes searching his face, as if trying to decipher his sincerity. "Yes, at my house," Richard confirmed, his voice firm. Lily studied his expression for a long moment, her gaze unwavering. She was trying to discern his intentions, to determine if he was telling the truth, if she could dare to trust this unexpected lifeline. She had learned to be cautious, to protect herself and her brothers from further harm, but the possibility of a safe haven, of a temporary respite from their struggles, was a beacon of hope in the darkness. "For how long?" Lily asked, her voice small and hesitant, her gaze searching Richard's with an intensity that belied her young age. She had learned to anticipate the worst, to prepare for disappointment, and the uncertainty of the situation weighed heavily on her. She was willing to embrace this unexpected opportunity, this chance at a semblance of normalcy, but she also needed to protect herself and her brothers from further heartbreak. Richard hesitated, his mind racing, trying to formulate an honest answer without shattering the fragile hope that had begun to blossom between them. He was a man who valued precision and clarity, but he was also learning the art of navigating delicate emotions, of offering reassurance without making promises he couldn't keep. "I don't know," he admitted finally, his voice low and thoughtful. "Maybe a few months. It depends on what the social worker finds out." "And then?" Lily pressed, her gaze unwavering. The question hung in the air, a stark reminder of the impermanence of their situation, the possibility that this newfound stability could be snatched away at any moment. Richard had no answer for that. He hadn't allowed himself to think beyond the immediate crisis, the urgent need to provide these children with a safe haven. He was a man who planned for the future, who meticulously charted his course, but he was now confronted with the uncomfortable reality that some things were beyond his control. He didn't know what the future held for them, whether he would be able to provide a permanent home, whether the system would intervene and tear them apart. All he knew was that he couldn't abandon them, that he had a responsibility to protect them for as long as he could. "We'll figure it out," he said finally, his voice firm with determination. "For now, the important thing is that you're together and safe." Just then, Dr. Ramirez reappeared with good news. "Sammy has responded well to the treatment," he announced, his voice cheerful and reassuring. "He's still weak, but he's stable, and he's going to be fine." Lily's face lit up with relief, the fear that had been etched on her features replaced by a fragile smile. The doctor explained that Sammy would need to stay in the hospital for a few more days, but with proper care, he would make a full recovery. Richard felt an unexpected surge of joy, a profound sense of gratitude that washed over him. He was a man who rarely allowed himself to feel emotions, but the sight of Lily's happiness, the knowledge that the baby was out of danger, touched him in a way he couldn't explain. He was beginning to realize that the most valuable things in life were not measured in dollars and cents, but in the connections we forge with others, in the capacity for love and compassion. In the pediatric ward, Sammy was hooked up to tubes, but he looked much better. His breathing was easier, his color returning to normal. "Sammy," Lily whispered, approaching the crib with a tentative smile. "You're getting better, my love." Richard watched the scene unfold, his heart filled with a strange warmth. The way Lily spoke to her brother, her voice filled with tenderness and affection. The way Mikey reached out his tiny hands towards the crib. The way Sammy's eyes fluttered open at the sound of their voices. It was a tableau of family, a bond of love that transcended blood ties. He was an outsider looking in, a witness to a connection that was both profound and deeply moving. He was beginning to understand that the life he had built, the life of ambition and achievement, had been lacking a fundamental element, the simple, unadulterated joy of human connection. "You can take him home tomorrow afternoon," the doctor said, his words a final confirmation that Sammy was on the road to recovery. "But he'll need medication every 8 hours and a checkup every day for a week." Richard nodded, grateful for the doctor's care and expertise. He was beginning to realize the immense responsibility he had undertaken, the constant vigilance and attention these children would require. He was a man who valued his freedom and independence, but he was also discovering a profound sense of purpose in caring for these vulnerable lives. The thought of bringing them into his home, of creating a family, was both daunting and exhilarating, a complete departure from the life he had always known. After the hospital, Richard took Lily and Mikey to a shopping mall. It was Lily's first time in such a place, a dazzling spectacle of consumerism and abundance that stood in stark contrast to the poverty she had always known. She stood wide-eyed, taking in the towering stores, the glittering lights, the throngs of people moving with purpose. The sheer scale of it all, the overwhelming display of wealth and luxury, was both fascinating and unsettling. She had lived in the shadows, invisible to the eyes of the privileged, and now she was thrust into the heart of their world, a world that seemed both alluring and alien. Richard watched her, his heart touched by her awe and wonder, and a sense of protectiveness stirred within him. He wanted to give her everything she had been denied, to shield her from the harsh realities of the past, but he also knew that he couldn't erase her experiences, that they had shaped her into the resilient and compassionate young woman she was. "Is all this stuff owned by just one person?" Lily asked, pointing to a massive clothing store with a bewildered expression. The sheer scale of the retail space, the endless racks of clothing, the glittering displays, was a stark contrast to the cramped and desolate world she was accustomed to. Richard chuckled, a genuine and unguarded sound that surprised even himself. It was the first time he had truly smiled all day, the weight of his responsibilities momentarily lifted by Lily's innocent wonder. "No, it's many different stores," he explained, his voice gentle. "Each one sells different things." He found himself enjoying the role of guide, of introducing Lily to a world she had never experienced, a world that he had always taken for granted. It was a strange and unexpected pleasure, a departure from the cutthroat world of business into the simple joy of sharing a new experience with a child. They went first to buy the essentials: 2 cribs, baby clothes, diapers, formula, bottles. Richard handed his credit card to the salesperson without even glancing at the prices. He was accustomed to spending large sums of money on business deals, on investments, on acquisitions, but this felt different. This was not about profit or gain, but about providing for the basic needs of 3 vulnerable lives. Lily watched each purchase with a mixture of awe and disbelief, her eyes wide with wonder. The sheer abundance of it all, the overflowing shopping cart, the casual extravagance of Richard's spending, was a stark contrast to the scarcity and deprivation she had always known. It was as if she had stepped into a dream, a world where her brother's needs were met without struggle, where her own desires were acknowledged and fulfilled. The experience was both exhilarating and overwhelming, a glimpse into a future she had never dared to imagine. "Can I pick out the clothes?" Lily asked shyly, her voice barely audible above the bustling sounds of the mall. Richard smiled, his heart touched by her tentative request. He was beginning to see that this experience was not just about providing for their basic needs, but also about giving Lily a chance to express herself, to reclaim a piece of her childhood that had been stolen by circumstance. "Of course," he replied, his voice warm and encouraging. "Pick out whatever you like." Lily's eyes widened with delight, a genuine spark of joy igniting within her. She carefully selected a few items for the babies: soft white and blue onesies, 2 snug-fitting sleepers with animal prints, and tiny socks that seemed impossibly small. For herself, she only asked for a simple t-shirt and a pair of jeans, her practical nature overriding any desire for extravagance. Richard watched her, his heart filled with a mixture of admiration and sadness. He saw a young girl who had been forced to grow up too quickly, who had sacrificed her own needs for the sake of her brothers, and he felt a profound desire to provide her with a life where she could simply be a child. "Don't you want more clothes?" Richard asked, his voice gentle. "With this it's fine," Lily replied, her gaze unwavering. Richard hesitated for a moment, then led her to the girls' section, his arm sweeping across the racks of colorful clothing. He filled a shopping cart with t-shirts, pants, dresses, shoes, and underwear, his choices guided by an instinctual desire to provide her with the wardrobe she deserved. Lily stared at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "It's too much," she whispered, her voice overwhelmed by the sheer abundance. "It's not too much," Richard countered, his tone firm but kind. "It's what you need." He wanted to give her the opportunity to experience the simple joys of childhood, the pleasure of choosing her own clothes, the feeling of being cared for and cherished. He was beginning to understand that his role in their lives was not just that of a provider, but also that of a protector, a caregiver, a surrogate parent. In the toy store, Richard was at a loss. He had no idea what kind of toys children played with, his experience limited to board games and golf clubs. Lily, however, navigated the aisles with a quiet confidence, her eyes drawn to the simple age-appropriate items. She chose rattles for the babies and a small plush teddy bear, her selections practical and understated. Richard watched her, his heart touched by her selflessness. She was surrounded by a world of toys, a dazzling array of colors and sounds, but her concern remained focused on her brothers. He was beginning to see that her maturity, her sense of responsibility, had come at a cost, a sacrifice of her own childhood desires. He felt a profound desire to nurture the child within her, to offer her the opportunity to experience the simple joys of play and imagination. "Don't you want something for yourself?" Richard asked, his voice gentle, his gaze encouraging. Lily hesitated for a moment, her eyes darting between the shelves filled with dolls and games. "The babies are more important," she replied softly, her words a testament to her unwavering devotion. Richard took her hand and placed a beautiful doll in her arms, its eyes wide and innocent. He also added a few coloring books and a box of crayons to the cart, his choices guided by an instinctual desire to spark her creativity and imagination. "The babies also need their big sister to be happy," he said, his voice firm but kind. He wanted to give her permission to be a child again, to embrace the simple pleasures of her age, to shed the burden of responsibility that had weighed her down for so long. He was beginning to understand that his role in their lives was not just that of a provider, but also that of a healer, a guide, a facilitator of their emotional well-being. When they arrived at Richard's mansion in Oak Brook, Lily fell silent, her eyes wide as she took in the enormous house, the perfectly manicured lawn, the elegant fountain at the entrance. It was a world of opulence and grandeur beyond anything she had ever imagined, a stark contrast to the dilapidated warehouse that had been her home. She felt a mixture of awe and trepidation, a sense of being overwhelmed by the sheer scale of Richard's wealth and privilege. She wondered how she and her brothers could possibly fit into this world, how they could ever belong in this place of such extravagant beauty. The transition from the shadows to the spotlight was both exhilarating and intimidating, a leap into the unknown that challenged her sense of identity and belonging. "Do you live here alone?" Lily asked, her voice barely audible, her gaze sweeping over the vast expanse of the property. Richard smiled, his expression warm and reassuring. Yes, well, now you live here too. He wanted to convey that this was not just his house but their home, a place where they could feel safe and loved. He was beginning to see that his wealth was meaningless without someone to share it with, that true happiness lay not in the accumulation of possessions, but in the creation of meaningful connections. He was embarking on a journey of transformation, a shift from a life of solitary ambition to a life of shared experiences and familial bonds. Mrs. Jenkins greeted them at the door, her face kind and welcoming. Richard had called her from the mall to explain the situation, and she had readily agreed to help. She was a woman of compassion and empathy, and she saw in Lily and her brothers not burdens, but children in need of love and care. "Welcome, child," Mrs. Jenkins said to Lily, her voice filled with warmth. "Are you hungry?" Lily nodded, her stomach rumbling with a hunger that had been a constant companion for far too long. "Let's go to the kitchen. I'll make you something delicious." As Mrs. Jenkins led Lily away, Richard felt a surge of gratitude for her willingness to embrace this unexpected change in their lives. He was beginning to realize that he couldn't do this alone, that he needed help and support to navigate the uncharted territory of parenthood. While Mrs. Jenkins prepared dinner, Richard and the driver assembled the cribs in the guest room. Richard, who had never assembled a piece of furniture in his life, struggled with the instructions, his usual efficiency and competence replaced by a clumsy uncertainty. But with persistence and a bit of trial and error, he managed to put the cribs together, his efforts fueled by a determination to create a safe and comfortable space for the babies. In the dining room, Lily ate in silence, savoring each bite of the delicious meal Mrs. Jenkins had prepared. Richard noticed that she chewed slowly, deliberately, as if trying to make the food last longer. He felt a pang of guilt, a stark reminder of the hunger and deprivation these children had endured. He was beginning to understand the profound impact his actions had had on their lives, the transition from a world of scarcity to a world of abundance, and the responsibility he now carried to ensure their well-being.